In this video, I want to introduce macromolecules and talk a little bit about carbohydrates and lipids. There will be a second video where I talk about proteins and nucleic acids, the other half of the macromolecule package in our bodies. So macromolecules are very large molecules, that's where the macro comes from, found in cells. Now actually water is the most abundant chemical in our cell, but when you take the water out, what is left are these macromolecules, and especially proteins. You can see proteins take up the biggest part of this bar graph on the right. Other macromolecules, polysaccharides, those are carbohydrates. DNA and RNA are nucleic acids, and then phospholipids are in your lipid category. So up through this, from the yellow to the blue bar, these are all macromolecules, very large, very important biological molecules. And then there's a little bit of other chemicals, ions, small molecules, things like iron that you might have heard about, or calcium that are in your bones. But most of you are made up of these big molecules known as macromolecules. All of our macromolecules are built around carbon. In fact, we say there's a carbon backbone because it's the central element found in these molecules. Carbon is a very unique element because it can make single, double, or triple bonds, and the bonds will determine whether it is a linear molecule or maybe it's bent a little bit in the middle, or perhaps even a ring like we see down here with our example of benzene. So these bonds will determine the shape of the molecule, and then the shape or the form determines the function, because remember the form follows function, and so it's the different shapes of molecules that happen with these carbon-based molecules that allow these macromolecules to have the functions in our body that keep us alive. Now, macromolecules are polymers, and polymers are built from smaller molecules all hooked together, which are known as monomers. So mono meaning one and poly meaning many. In the biological sciences, we call these polymers macromolecules, or very big molecules, or biomolecules, so molecules that are really important to life or to biology. When they're hooked from a monomer into a polymer, it's known as a process of polymerization. There are four categories of biomolecules or macromolecules, and for some reason I put them in a slightly different order on this slide, but those four categories are proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. So today we're going to be focusing on these two. The monomer of protein are amino acids, which I hope you remember from biology class, where how the amino acids are hooked together to make proteins. Lipids don't have a true monomer, but many of our lipids contain fatty acid chains, which you'll hear more about in a moment. The monomer for carbohydrate are monosaccharides. Again, we see mono, so it's a single something that's put together. And then nucleic acids are monomer, are nucleotides. And again, when you were talking about DNA back in biology, that was the A, T, C, and Gs that we used in talking about the genetic code. So making and breaking macromolecules as water is a very important part of that whole process. Cells link the monomers together by a process called either condensation, because we're taking water out of it, or dehydration synthesis. So if you look at these two monomers here, you'll see that we have a OH group, a hydroxyl group on either end. And if you remove both the oxygen and the hydrogen from this side and just the hydrogen from the other side, a bond can form between these two molecules, and this water can kind of go off by itself. It can be taken out of the equation. So this is an example of dehydration synthesis. We're taking water out to hook these two monosaccharides together to make a disaccharide, di meaning two in this case. The reverse process is known as hydrolysis, or breaking these molecules apart by adding water. You can see hydro in the beginning of this word, and then lysis just means to cut. So by putting water in between a carbon bond, or what carbon bonded to something else, and splitting the water, so again a hydroxyl group goes on one side and just a hydrogen on the other, water has been split apart, but so has the molecule. And in this case we have a longer protein that is being made into a shorter protein or a peptide, and then just a free amino acid. Both dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis are the process used to make and break any of these macromolecules. So let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates now. Carbohydrates are composed of three elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And food provides us both digestible and indigestible carbohydrates. Your digestible carbohydrates, which can be further divided into simple carbs and complex carbs, are used in your body to produce ATP through the process of cellular respiration, which I hope you do remember a bit about. Those carbohydrates are also used to build other molecules. For example, both DNA and RNA contain a sugar, deoxyribose or in DNA and ribose in RNA. So the carbohydrates you eat are used to help build those two very important nucleic acids. Glycoproteins, which are antigens found on the surface of our cells, identifying them as cells that belong to our body, well, this word glyco also is referring to a carbohydrate. So it's a carbohydrate plus a protein that make up the antigen. And then carbohydrates can be stored for future energy needs, either as glycogen, which is a carbohydrate found in your liver and in your muscles, or changed into fats, which have a more long-term storage possibility. And then finally, the carbohydrates that you cannot digest are known as dietary fiber, but they still are important for health and homeostasis. They help keep our digestive systems healthy on a variety of levels, both for ourself and for the microbiome that live inside our guts. And these certain types of these dietary fibers can help control blood cholesterol levels, so they actually can travel outside of the digestive system, even though we can't break them down and get the individual smaller molecules out of those carbohydrates. Just want to talk a minute about monosaccharides. So those are the monomers, the building blocks for carbohydrates. They are also known as simple sugars, and they do taste sweet to us. Three important monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose, and all three of these are isomers, which mean they have the same chemical formula. They are all C6H12O6, but they have different structural formulas. So if you look on the diagram here of our glucose, galactose, and fructose, you can see like the fructose has the double bond between carbon and oxygen here kind of in the middle of the chain, whereas both glucose and galactose, it's here on this end. And then just what sides have the OHs or the hydroxy and which sides have the hydrogens, you can see we have a little bit of difference here. Incidentally, table sugar, which is known as sucrose, is a disaccharide, and it's made up of glucose and fructose. In aqueous or watery solutions in our cells, remember our bodies are about 3/4 water, these monosaccharides actually form ring structures, which is why you see them often drawn as a 6-sided hexagon or possibly a 5-sided pentagon, since ribose and fructose make 5-sided circles. So this double arrow just tells you that it can go back and forth, but in reality, since our bodies are pretty aqueous, the carbohydrates, these monosaccharides, will be found in this ring shape. So polysaccharides, long chains of monosaccharides, come in basically 3 different forms. The glucose monomer is we can see the little hexagon here, and starch is just one single long chain, and starch is digested. The glucose is just chopped off here by your digestive system, so eating something that is high in starch is just like eating something that is sweet with sugar, so far as your digestive system is concerned. Glycogen is how your body stores glucose in the liver, and so this is what you use to store extra glucose, and again, it can be chopped off very easily when you need to have some more sugar in your blood. Cellulose is one of those dietary fibers, things that you can't digest, and it forms more of a flat sheet, and it's all these cross-linkings across the various chains of glucose that make it so difficult for us to digest. But bacteria can digest it and get the energy out of it. Now let's move on to lipids. Lipids are also composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which would give you a clue as to why extra carbohydrates can be turned into fat in your body, because it has the same chemical elements. It's sort of an easy switch. Lipids, as I said before, don't have a true monomer, but most contain at least one fatty acid acid chain, and a fatty acid chain is a long carbon-hydrogen chain, carbon with hydrogens attached to it, ending in what is known as a COOH, or carboxyl group, which is carbon double bonded to this oxygen, and then a hydroxyl group on the other side. Most of our lipids are hydrophobic, they are water-fearing, and fats and oils, waxes, and steroids are all examples of lipids. The lipids that we eat are known as triglycerides, and they have this format where you have 3 fatty acid chains, and this little zigzag line is just a shortcut that biochemists use to show a carbon-hydrogen chain. So at each of the points here, this is actually a carbon with some hydrogen attached to it, and then the line you follow down to another carbon with some hydrogen attached to it, but it's just much quicker to draw a zigzag line instead of writing all these C's and H's. So we have 3 fatty acid chains, and then at the other end we have this molecule known as glycerol. And so that's why we have a triglyceride. That's where the name comes from. Triglycerides then are the fats in the foods that we eat. It is used in our body. It is stored because it'll store a lot of energy. It stores calories more densely than any other molecule. But fat also has other important roles. It provides protection and insulation around body organs. So the back of your eyes have a fatty layer to provide some protection there against the eyeballs kind of bouncing around in the hard socket of your skull. And lipids are used to build other molecules, or triglycerides are used to build other important molecules like the phospholipids that are found in your cell membrane, or many of your hormones. The fatty acid chains can be either saturated or unsaturated, and I know you've heard those terms in regards to food. Saturated fatty acid chains only have single bonds, so this is an example of what a saturated fatty acid chain would look like if you wrote out the chemical structure. So you can see all the carbons are bonded to all the other carbons with just a single bond, and it creates a very linear molecule, very straight. Whereas your unsaturated fats have at least one double bond, and this double bond actually causes a bend in the molecule. And so saturated fatty acids tend to be more solid at room temperature because they pack together more tightly than these unsaturated ones that have bends in various places, and the layers of fatty acid chains can't lie on top of each other tightly as well. Let's talk a minute about phospholipids. Phospholipids are what your cell membrane is made of. Phospholipids have a head end that likes water. It's a polar end, hydrophilic, and then 2 tails which are nonpolar or not liking water, hydrophobic. See, my picture's gone over my word a little bit here, but you can see it again down here. So here's a larger diagram showing you that the hydrophilic head with our phosphate group, the PO4, and then a glycerol molecule is kind of connecting everything together. So the glycerol, like you have in a triglyceride, has been modified to put a phosphate on it. But you only have 2 fatty acid chains, and so it's usually drawn as you see this little circle with legs hanging down. The phospholipids will automatically form this bilayer, and this is what we see on our cell membrane, where the fatty acid chains end up in the middle, the hydrophobic tails end up in the middle, and then the water-loving or the hydrophilic heads are on either side. And then finally, I want to talk a minute about steroids, which are important molecules for many things, for body growth and development, as well as sexual function and reproduction. The base molecule for all steroids is cholesterol. This is one that you make, and then it can be made into other things. Cholesterol is also important to providing stability to your cell membranes. It's found in between those phospholipids on your cell membrane. The carbon skeleton of the steroids is 4 rings, which you can see over here. They're colored in yellow, but we basically have 4 rings. And again, each of these straight lines, when you come to the corner, that's going to be a carbon with some hydrogens attached. And so you can see some of these are 6 carbon rings, and over here we have a 5 carbon ring. Then we have a short fatty acid chain hanging off the cholesterol. So the cholesterol can be turned into testosterone, and testosterone can be turned into estrogen. Also, cholesterol can be turned directly into estrogen, depending upon the pathway and what's needed in the body. So you really are what you eat because the macromolecules that you have in your body are made from the macromolecules in the food that you eat. You take in food and break it down in digestion, and the fancy word for that is catabolism. Then those smaller molecules are absorbed and they are built into something else, and building up is called anabolism. So catabolism and anabolism are two other words that we use to talk about breaking things down and building it up inside the body. The carbohydrates that you need in your body can come directly from food, or they can be built from protein. So you actually don't have to eat any carbohydrate. As long as you're eating enough protein, you can make all the carbohydrates you need for the DNA and the RNA nucleic acid sugars, or for glycoproteins in your cells. But generally, we are eating carbohydrates because we like the foods that contain them. There are certain essential fatty acids that must be eaten. You cannot build them within the body. But really, that's a very small amount of lipids. So you don't have to have a large amount of lipids to get those essential fatty acids. We generally, in the American diet, don't have any problem getting those fats. So that provides a brief overview to carbohydrates and lipids. And as I said in the next video, we'll talk about proteins and nucleic acids.